Welcome back to the Brahmin Word, and we are continuing on with the life of Solomon. And of course, we have to continue to see the wisdom that Solomon brings to the table. And so that's what we see at the end of chapter 9 in First Kings. So go with me to First Kings chapter 9. We're going to start at verse 10 and then go through the chapter, through the end of the chapter in verse 28. So at the end of 20 years, in which Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house, and Hiram king of Tyre had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress timber and gold, as much as he desired, King Solomon gave to Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. Now, before we get to what comes from that, so we are given a little bit of a time frame, though. So it takes 20 years to build these two houses, the temple and Solomon's house. And so this is basically half of Solomon's reign, of his 40-year reign, is the building of these two homes. And really, it's probably maybe a little less than that because it probably didn't start from day one. But anyways, let's say it did. So half of his reign was building these two homes. So if that's the case, then it is a very big deal for Solomon to get the temple right and the building of his own home right. And so therefore, as we saw earlier, he has basically established this partnership with Hiram, king of Tyre, and now he is giving him 20 cities in the land of Galilee. However, they don't really appeal too much to Hiram. Verse 12. But when Hiram came from Tyre to see the cities that Solomon had given him, they did not please him. Therefore he said, What kind of cities are these that you have given me, my brother? So they are called the land of Kabul to this day. Hiram had sent to the king 120 talents of gold, talent being about 75 pounds. So basically 75 times 120, that's how many pounds of gold Hiram had sent to Solomon. So on the surface, you could say that Solomon was being unwise by giving him these 20 cities that he's not pleased with. But we don't really see why he wasn't pleased with them. Now, obviously, in the Gospels, we see Galilee as a very shipping oriented, a very big seafood area. So it could be that Hiram was not expecting that. But yet Galilee was not some just completely waste of a land in the time of Jesus. And I don't think it is here, but it doesn't please him. My guess, he was hoping for some more of the luxurious parts of Israel. So in my mind, from what we see here, I actually would think it would be wise of Solomon not to give Hiram the best of the best, even if Hiram has given him all of these resources to do this grand project. It's not like he isn't getting paid in some form. He's still getting a lot of land, which, as important as it is today, it may have been even more important back then. So, do I see a lack of wisdom here on Solomon's part? I don't really. But let's see what continues on. Verse 15. And this is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon drafted to build the house of the Lord in his own house, and the Millo, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, and Megiddo, and Gezer. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and captured Gezer and burned it with fire, and had killed the Canaanites who lived in the city, and had given it as dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife. So Solomon rebuilt Gezer and lower Beth-horon, and Baalath and Tamar and the wilderness, and in the land of Judah, and all the store cities that Solomon had, and the cities for his chariots, and the cities for his horsemen, and whatever Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem and Lebanon, and in all the land of his dominion. All the people who were left of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, who weren't of the people of Israel, their descendants who were left after them in the land, whom the people of Israel were unable to devote to destruction, these Solomon drafted to be slaves, and so they are to this day. But of the people of Israel, Solomon made no slaves. They were the soldiers, they were his officials, his commanders, his captains, his chariot commanders, and his horsemen. So, he goes about in a very obviously wise manner. He needs workers. Now, granted, there's a couple things that we want to touch base on. Verse 22, the fact that he doesn't make any of the Israelite slaves, obviously a very wise move on his part, right, as a king of that country. But let's talk about the term slave here, or servant. There is this idea that after a certain time, you would let these quote unquote slaves or servants go. Is that what we see in verses 20 and 21 with all these ites? Possibly. However, I think it also bodes for us to look at verse 21 and the fact that you see that they have some sort of connection to the book of Joshua. And they are coming from lines that have disobeyed the Lord time and time again. And so the Lord has given up, quote unquote, given up on them, and has turned his view towards Israel as his holy people. Now, that doesn't mean that the Lord has given up on them when it comes to he will never accept them into his kingdom, but it does give us a connection to the fact that they should be dead, but they're not. And so the fact that they're even still alive is a blessing in itself. And so the fact that they are now being used to work is quote unquote some sort of blessing. Now, what's interesting here, and I want to make sure that this is heard time and time again throughout Scripture. The Lord never the Lord never encourages slavery. He never does. Obviously, we see that throughout history, that slavery was used multiple times. But we never see in the Bible where the Lord encourages slavery. He allows it for a time. He even allows it to happen to his own people, to bring them back to himself, especially with the hundreds of years in slavery in Egypt. But he never encourages it. He never says, "Oh, slavery is a great idea." No, he never says that. So I just want to make sure that that is made clear. And this is one of the hard parts of Scripture, reading it, especially within our historical context in the United States. It's a word that is very hard to read and to hear. But there are parts of it that I think when we dig deeper, we could see some differences between the two. And so I just want to make sure that that is seen before we go on. Verse 23. These were the chief officers who were over Solomon's work, 550 who had charge of the people who carried on the work. And so you had a lot of people being put over this. It's not just Solomon, but it's a lot of people. That's wise. This, however, I don't know if it's too wise or not. Verse 24. But Pharaoh's daughter went up from the city of David to her own house that Solomon had built for her. Then he built the Millo. The Millo, that's a building construction. But I'm talking about the first part of verse 24. The fact that Pharaoh's daughter, who is one of the wives of Solomon, key point one of, we'll get to that later. But the fact that she no longer lives with Solomon in the in the house that Solomon has built for himself, let alone in the city that he reigns in, should send out a red flag. It should say, okay, something is going on here where one of his wives is starting to distance herself from his people. And eventually that will grab his heart and start to distance Solomon from the Lord. But again, we'll get to that later. Verse 25. 3 times a year Solomon used to offer up burnt offerings and peace offerings on the altar that he built to the Lord, making offerings with it before the Lord. So he finished the house. King Solomon built a fleet of ships at Ezion-geber, which is near Elat, on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. And Hiram sent with the fleet his servants, seamen who were familiar with the sea, together with the servants of Solomon. And they went to Ophir and brought from their gold 420 talents, so 475 times 420, and that's how many pounds of gold there was, and they brought it to King Solomon. So Solomon is seen very much as a man of business. He understands how to run things. He understands how to do things. For the most part, this is a passage to show the strength of Solomon's wisdom, as we will see in part in next week in 1 Kings chapter 10. But then we see verse 24, and it begins to see it. We see a crack in Solomon's wisdom. We start to see a slight crack, which will grow at the end of 1 Kings chapter 10. So we will get to that point later. But for here, it's all again, what do I do with the gifts that God has given me? Do I put them to use? Do I put them to the side? Or do I just use some, or do I just use them some of the times and then not at all the others? I think we're supposed to use them whenever God has called us to use them. And if we aren't sure about something, or if we need help, ask. Solomon, with all of his wisdom, understands that he cannot be this politician on one side, this businessman on the other, and this devoted follower of the Lord all at once. Now, granted, he should be a devoted follower of the Lord over everything that he does. But he understands that he needs help, and so he sends out 550 chief officers, as we see in verse 23, to help delegate, to help to help put part of the burden of all of these different projects and governing a whole entire nation. He doesn't want to take it all upon himself, which is a very wise thing to do. And I know that we've seen this time and time again with Solomon, but I think that's because, well, it's important that we do. I think it's important that we see that that's a very big thing that we're supposed to see with Solomon. So with that being said, next week we will dive into 1 Kings chapter 10. This is a very interesting chapter. On the one hand, you have this great passage about the Queen of Sheba and Solomon, and we'll dive into that on Tuesday. But then next Thursday, we start to see that little chink in the armor of Solomon and his wisdom that we saw in verse 24 here in chapter 9. We see that grow at the end of chapter 10, and then sadly kind of go haywire from there. So with that being said, I will see you next week with the Brahmin Word. But thanks for spending time with me today. Thanks.